In May 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States released an 85-page report declaring loneliness the new public health crisis. Almost all liberal democracies are dealing with this problem. Loneliness is particularly malevolent because it affects more than the mental health of citizens. The philosopher Hannah Arendt puts it best in her book titled The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says, "What makes loneliness so unbearable is the loss of one's own self, which can be realized in solitude, but confirmed in its identity only by trusting and trustworthy company of my equals." In this situation, man loses trust in himself as the partner of his thoughts, and that elementary confidence in the world which is necessary to make experiences at all. Self and the world, capacity for thought and experience, are lost at the same time. What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. Loneliness has dire political consequences because it closes one's mind. A lonely person cannot think properly. Human beings are both social and political creatures. Human beings can think and grow when interacting with people who hold different perspectives. Sociability is a dimension of human life that loneliness nullifies. Through isolation, people become a lot more susceptible to extreme ideas and polarizing messages. This is the nefarious underpinning of loneliness and why it has become one of the most important political problems liberal societies face today. Liberalism has been critiqued for its emphasis on individuality rather than the group, making it complicit in the creation of this very problem. Is this critique valid? This is what we are going to look at today in this video. Let's start by describing what the critique is. Liberalism's emphasis on the rights of individuals has been criticized by both conservatives and Marxists, but for very different reasons. The Marxists criticize liberalism's conception of individualism by pointing out the regime's reliance on capitalism. To simplify, basically, liberalism's emphasis on individual freedom reinforces capitalist agenda because in a liberal society, to satisfy people's individuality, there are certain rights that will necessitate the entrenchment of capitalism, in particular, the right to own private property. Many liberals would argue that praising individual rights is meaningless without entrenching property rights first. By emphasizing individuality at the expense of the community, liberals are actively contributing to exploitation of the poor by advocating for the rights to own property, which always primarily helps the property-owning class. This separates people from each other by forcing them to look for their own interest rather than their communities. Conservative critics argue that liberalism's emphasis on individualism ignores immaterial conditions people need to feel more fulfilled, things like spirituality, obligation, religion, love, and deep, meaningful bonds. Liberalism's marriage to capitalism reduces politics to economy and human beings to consumers who only look at their own material prosperity. Think of Bill Clinton's infamous statement that it's the economy, stupid. Although odd bedfellows, both Marxists and conservatives have a similar critique. Liberalism forces people to become selfish individuals concerned with their own material prosperity at the expense of the community. There is a loosely associated group of scholars called Communitarians. I say loosely because their philosophies are significantly different from each other, and they all have rejected the label communitarians, but they are generally grouped together by the virtue of their emphasis on the relationship between the individual and the community. They have termed this problem atomism. One of these thinkers, Charles Taylor, describes atomism in the following manner. The term atomism is used loosely to characterize the doctrines of social contract theory, which arose in the 17th century, and also successor doctrines which may not have made use of the notion of social contract, but which inherited a vision of society as in some sense constituted by individuals for the fulfillment of ends which were primarily individual. Certain forms of utilitarianism are successor doctrines in this sense. The term is also applied to contemporary doctrines which hark back to social contract theory, or which try to defend, in some sense, the priority of the individual and his rights over society, or which present a purely instrumental view of society. Atomism states that the fixation on individual results in people becoming alienated from each other, by viewing their communities as a means to their own personal gain. Such critics would argue that liberalism's emphasis on the rights of individuals makes it culpable in the loneliness crisis today. Liberal individualism does result in the regime's marriage to capitalism. This is true. Francis Fukuyama, in his book Liberalism and Its Discontents, explicitly shows this. Liberalism is always allied with capitalism on the one hand and democracy on the other. Capitalism can be implemented without liberalism. There also has been a rise of illiberal democracies in countries like Hungary, which suggests democracy can also be implemented without liberalism. However, to think of liberalism without capitalism and democracy seems impossible. Liberalism needs both democracy and capitalism to function properly. Left to our own devices, people will inevitably look to their material interests first and foremost. Therefore, the critique made against liberalism's focus on individual rights is to some extent true. However, the claim that it is liberal individualism which is making us more lonely is not. Let's use dating as an example. Now, I have very little experience in this field because I spend my days praying at the altar of John Rawls I made in my basement. But I do know a bit of history. Throughout history, responsibilities were distributed along gender lines. Men were tasked with working outside because jobs were physically demanding, and women were tasked with dealing with the household chores out of necessity. This is a general norm, and one can find numerous exceptions throughout history, but generally, this was the norm. During World War II, men went off fighting, but somebody needed to work the factories still. So women entered the workforce in mass. After World War II, men came back to work, and there was a concentrated propaganda to push women out of the workforce. However, women, understandably, liked making money, and men also liked making money. So, as a result, more and more households became double-income households, which was at the time very lucrative for the entire family. Today, it is pretty much impossible to live in a big city in North America without a double-income household. However, if both men and women are now entering the workforce, who is going to manage the house? When there is demand, capitalism will deliver the supply. Long story short, today we have things like Uber Eats, Skip the Dishes, and numerous cleaning services, meaning we no longer really need to know each other for our daily needs to be met. We can get anything online, from groceries to cleaning services to books to even love. 2023 has also seen a huge rise of work-from-home policies, which means many don't even need to leave their house to make money anymore. In 2023, we have become less reliant on bonding with others because we became more independent. This is all due to liberalism encouraging individuals to become autonomous, and it should be no surprise that many technological innovations liberal countries have come up with is meant for that end. We have come to see each other in person less and less. With less interactions in person, forming meaningful bonds that will blossom into relationships has become more and more difficult. I am not suggesting the past was good. On the contrary, I think living in a liberal democratic nation today is the best place to be. However, our conditions are not perfect. Individualism is a fantastic political innovation, but like everything else, it has its drawbacks. As we become more and more independent, we tend to become more and more distant from each other, because in the past, we couldn't obtain our daily needs without bonding with others, whereas today we can. So does that mean the critiques of communitarians, conservatives, and Marxists are correct? Well, kinda, but also no. Liberal individualism does not need to distance us from each other. That is not its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is to give us as much freedom as it possibly can to ensure that we live our lives however we see fit within reason. Making meaningful connections has become difficult but not impossible. What we need to do is to take the initiative and put ourselves in situations where we meet like-minded people in person. We also need to look at chores more in terms of bonding activities rather than tasks one person is forced to do. For example, cooking can be a family bonding exercise where one person chops the vegetables while the other cleans the meat. We need to exercise our freedom in such a way that helps us form communities, and that requires work on our part as individuals. The solution to the problem of loneliness isn't a new political regime that limits individual freedom, but rather to have more liberally minded citizens who try to use their individual freedom to form meaningful bonds with others. Liberalism gives us the tools to succeed. How we use them falls onto us.